Millionaire rented his apartment to a single mother. One night, he found out she was a virgin, a secret that shattered his life. Hi, my beautiful family. Let's begin with a prayer, together as one. Dear God, guide me through this healing. Give strength to my body, peace to my heart, and blessings to every soul in this beautiful family. Protect them, uplift them, and let love flow through every screen. Amen. This is your Mr. Peter. I'm still in New York for treatment, but by God's grace, I'll be back in 2 days, stronger, smiling, and full of stories to share. I miss you deeply, and I thank you for your endless prayers and love. Now, please listen closely. If you ever see my videos on any other channel, that person is stealing my content, downloading my older videos and uploading them with slight edits. They are pretending to be me, but they are not part of our family. Please don't support them. Report them. Unsubscribe from any fake channel using my voice or stories. Also, my beautiful family. So many of you have joined us recently, and I'm truly honored. I want to know you. Please introduce yourself in the comments. Your name, where you're from, and how you found this channel. It would bring me joy while I recover to read about each of you. And one last thing, please don't leave the story halfway. Stay till the end. Your one like and comment can save this channel. Your support keeps us going, and I feel it with every breath. James will guide you today with care. Now let's begin this beautiful story, held together by love, by truth, and by family.
The woman drowning in Miami rain outside Phil Most's billion-dollar empire wasn't supposed to change his life, but she was clutching her daughter's hand like it was the only thing keeping them both from washing away forever. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office, Phil pressed his palm against the cool glass and watched the afternoon storm transform Biscayne Boulevard into chaos. The sudden downpour had caught everyone off guard. Tourists fled toward the Bayside marketplace, clutching designer shopping bags like shields, while locals ducked into familiar sanctuaries of Cuban cafeterias and air-conditioned boutiques. At 35, he'd built his real estate empire by controlling every variable, predicting every outcome, and never letting emotions interfere with business decisions. His corner office was a testament to that philosophy. Everything precisely arranged, from the mahogany desk positioned to catch morning light off the bay, to the collection of architectural awards that spoke of dreams transformed into steel and glass. Yet, something about the way this woman stood perfectly still in the downpour while everyone else ran for cover made his chest tighten with unfamiliar ache. She wasn't just enduring the storm, she was facing it head-on, her chin lifted with quiet determination that spoke of someone accustomed to weathering whatever life threw at her. She wasn't seeking shelter. She was gathering courage. "Mr. Most?" Savannah Blake's voice crackled through the intercom. "Your 3 o'clock appointment is here. She's quite wet." Phil glanced at his Patek Philippe, 2:58 p.m., the woman from his window. "Send them both up." 15 minutes later, Phil found himself staring at the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen, dripping rainwater onto his Italian marble floors like some kind of urban goddess emerging from the storm. Her dark skin had a luminous quality that made the gray day seem brighter, and her golden brown eyes held fierce protectiveness that spoke of battles he couldn't imagine. She was tall, perhaps 5'7" in her sensible black flats, with the kind of natural elegance that couldn't be bought or taught. Her simple black dress clung to curves that made his mouth go dry, but it was the quiet dignity in her posture, the way she kept one protective hand on the little girl's shoulder, that made him forget every practiced line he'd ever used. There was something almost regal about the way she held herself, despite being caught in the storm, as if adversity had only taught her to stand straighter, to face whatever came with grace that humbled him. "Miss Berridge," he said, his voice rougher than intended. "Mr. Most." Her honey-smooth voice carried strength that came from surviving things that would break lesser people. "I apologize for our appearance. The storm caught us off guard, and the bus—" "Bus?" Phil interrupted, genuinely surprised. Most of his prospective tenants arrived in luxury cars. A flush crept up her elegant neck. "Yes, I don't drive." She lifted her chin with quiet dignity. "Your listing mentioned apartment 15B?" Before Phil could respond, a small voice piped up with fearless curiosity. "Are you the nice man who's gonna let us live in the castle?" Phil looked down to find the most enchanting 5-year-old he'd ever seen. Her hair was arranged in neat pigtails despite the rain, each braid secured with bright yellow ribbons that matched the sunshine dress now dampened to golden amber. Her gap-toothed smile was radiant enough to power the building, and she stared up at him with pure trust that made his heart perform dangerous gymnastics. But it was her eyes that undid him completely, the same golden brown as her mother's, but filled with hope instead of wariness, love instead of caution. This child had been protected from whatever had taught her mother to guard her heart so carefully. "Jasim," Natasha said softly, embarrassed. "What did we talk about?" "To be polite and not ask too many questions," Jasim recited dutifully, then immediately added with the logic only children possessed, "But I really want to know if he's nice, 'cause you need someone nice, Mommy. You deserve nice things." The simple statement hit Phil like a physical blow, revealing a maturity that spoke of too much awareness of adult struggles. This little girl was worried about her mother in a way that made his protective instincts roar to life with surprising ferocity. He crouched down to Jasim's level. "What makes someone nice, Jasim?" She considered this with gravity only children possessed. "Well, they should make Mommy smile instead of worry, and they should have good snacks, and maybe they should know how to fix things when they break, and they shouldn't make promises they can't keep." "Those are very wise requirements," Phil told her seriously. "I think I might qualify." As they rode the elevator to the 15th floor, Phil found himself stealing glances at Natasha's profile. She carried herself with careful grace despite her obvious financial struggles, and there was something about her composure that made him want to see her truly relaxed, truly happy. "Morrison Financial," Phil said, remembering her employment information. "Impressive company." "I'm just an analyst," Natasha replied quickly. "Nothing fancy." Nothing fancy. This woman possessed more natural elegance than every society princess he'd ever dated combined. When he opened the door to 15B, both mother and daughter stepped inside with reverence usually reserved for cathedrals. The apartment was one of his favorites, panoramic views of Biscayne Bay, thoughtful details like the reading nook by the master bedroom window where parents could read to their children. "Oh," Natasha breathed, her professional mask slipping to reveal wonder. Jasim was already spinning in circles. "Mommy, look, I can see the water, and there's so much space for my books." Phil watched Natasha's face as she took in the gleaming kitchen, the hardwood floors that caught the stormlight, the balcony overlooking the bay. He saw the moment she fell in love with the space, followed by the careful shuddering as reality intruded. "It's beautiful, Mr. Most, but I should ask about the rent." $2,500 a month, Phil said. "That includes utilities, parking, and building amenities." She reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. "I brought first month's rent and security deposit. Cash, as specified." Phil accepted the envelope, surprised by its weight. This wasn't family money. This was someone who had saved every dollar for months. The bills were mostly 20s and 50s, worn soft from circulation. "There's also a background check fee, $150. For just a heartbeat, he saw a panic flicker in those golden brown eyes before she composed herself. "Of course, I can have that to you by—" "Actually, I'll waive it," Phil heard himself say. "Consider it a welcome gesture." Natasha's eyes searched his face suspiciously. That's very generous, but I don't accept charity. It's not charity, Phil said firmly. It's good business. I can tell you'll take excellent care of the place. As they finished the tour, Phil found himself pointing out features he'd already mentioned, asking questions he didn't need answers to. When Jassim discovered the balcony and pressed her nose to the glass door, Natasha moved to stand beside him, and he caught a hint of vanilla that made his head spin. She likes it here, Natasha said quietly. What about her mother? Phil asked, the words escaping before he could stop them. Natasha looked up at him, and for a moment her walls crumbled enough for him to glimpse the hope she was afraid to acknowledge. Her mother thinks it might be perfect. Then it's yours, Phil said without hesitation. I'll have Savannah draw up the lease tonight. Just like that. Just like that. As they prepared to leave, Jassim tugged on Phil's suit jacket. Mr. Nice Man, will we see you again? Phil looked down at this remarkable little girl, then up at her equally remarkable mother, whose golden brown eyes held gratitude mixed with wariness. I think that's very likely, Jassim. 2 hours later, Phil stood in his penthouse apartment, watching Natasha and Jassim wait at the bus stop in the still drizzling rain. Every instinct screamed at him to call his driver, but something told him Natasha Berridge wasn't the kind of woman who accepted help easily. As their bus pulled away and disappeared into Miami traffic, Phil found himself reaching for his phone, then stopping. For the first time in his carefully controlled life, he was completely off script, and the woman responsible was about to become his tenant. The woman with golden brown eyes and quiet dignity. The woman whose 5-year-old daughter had asked if he was nice, and somehow made him want to be worthy of the title. The woman who was about to turn his perfectly ordered world into something beautifully, chaotically different. He had a feeling his empire was about to become a home, and he couldn't wait to find out what that felt like. Chapter 2. The Weight of Beautiful Secrets. The roses on Natasha's desk weren't a romantic gesture. They were a predator marking his territory, and the way Bradford Kellaway's cologne lingered in the air around her workspace like invisible shackles made her skin crawl with the recognition that she was being hunted. 3 weeks had passed since she'd moved into Coral Heights. 3 weeks of daring to believe that maybe, just maybe, the universe had finally decided to show her mercy. Jassim was thriving at Palmetto Elementary, chattering about her new friends over breakfast each morning, while the Miami sun painted their apartment in shades of hope. Her work at Morrison Financial challenged her in ways that made her feel valuable, relevant, like more than just a woman drowning in circumstances beyond her control. But staring at the dozen blood-red roses that had appeared on her desk during her lunch break, their thorns sharp enough to draw blood, their petals the color of warning, Natasha felt that familiar dread coiling in her stomach, like a serpent preparing to strike. No card, no signature, but the roses reeked of Bradford's expensive cologne, Tom Ford Oud wood that probably cost more than she spent on groceries in a month. The scent clung to everything he touched, marking his territory like some primitive animal ritual that made her want to scrub her skin raw. Admiring your flowers, gorgeous. Bradford Kellaway's voice slithered across her skin like oil over water, and Natasha didn't need to turn around to know he was wearing that predatory smile that made her think of sharks circling wounded prey. At 42, Morrison Financial's golden boy still possessed the kind of privileged good looks that had opened every door in his charmed life. Sandy hair that always looked artfully disheveled, blue eyes the color of winter ice, and the kind of casual confidence that came from never hearing the word no. But Natasha could see the rot beneath the Armani suits and perfect veneers, could smell the entitlement that soured his expensive cologne and turned his handsome face into something grotesque. "They're very unexpected, Mr. Kellaway," she said carefully, not turning from her computer screen where quarterly bond assessments provided a flimsy digital shield between them. Her voice remained steady despite the way her pulse hammered against her throat like a trapped bird. "Call me Bradford," he purred, moving to perch on the edge of her desk with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never been denied access to anything he wanted. His proximity made the air feel thick, suffocating. "I think we're past formalities, don't you? After all, talented women like you deserve special attention." The way he said special attention made Natasha's skin crawl, each syllable dripping with implications that made her stomach revolt. She forced her fingers to continue typing, watching meaningless numbers blur across her screen, while every instinct screamed at her to run. "I appreciate your recognition of my work," she replied diplomatically, clinging to professionalism like a life raft in stormy seas. "The Henderson Municipal Bond Analysis should be ready by close of business." "Work." Bradford's laugh was like breaking glass, sharp enough to cut. "Always so focused on work. You know what I admire about you, Natasha." His hand moved to her shoulder, fingers pressing against her collarbone through the thin fabric of her blouse with possessive familiarity that made her flesh crawl. "You're not like the other girls here. You've got depth, substance, a woman who knows what she wants." Natasha's muscles tensed under his touch, but she didn't pull away. She'd learned long ago that rejecting men like Bradford too forcefully only escalated their interest, transformed pursuit into obsession. Better to be the mouse that stayed very, very still while the cat decided whether to pounce. "What I want is to excel in my position and provide for my daughter," she said quietly, proud that her voice didn't shake despite the terror clawing at her throat. "Ah, yes, the little girl." Bradford's grip tightened slightly, his thumb stroking along her neck in a gesture that made bile rise in her throat. "Jasim, isn't it? Sweet kid. Must be expensive, raising a child alone in Miami. Private school, nice apartment." His voice dropped to an intimate whisper that felt like a violation. "Lucky thing you have someone looking out for your best interests." The threat was subtle but unmistakable, wrapped in concern like poison in honey. Natasha's blood turned to ice as she realized the roses weren't just unwanted attention. They were a declaration of intent. Bradford hadn't just been watching her. He'd been studying her, learning her vulnerabilities, cataloging her pressure points like a scientist preparing to dissect a specimen. He knew about Jasim's school. He knew about their apartment. He'd been building a case against her from the moment she'd rejected his first advance, constructing a web of leverage designed to trap her so completely that escape would be impossible. "I managed just fine on my own," she said, quietly, each word carefully measured. "Of course you do," Bradford murmured, his voice carrying the kind of condescension that made her want to slap the smugness from his face. "But imagine how much easier things could be with the right mentorship. I've been thinking about your career development, Natasha. There are opportunities for advancement that don't come along often, not for someone in your delicate position." The emphasis on delicate position made her stomach churn. Single mother, financial struggles, no family support system, no safety net. Bradford had done his homework, and every weakness she possessed was now ammunition in his arsenal. Before Natasha could formulate a response that wouldn't escalate the situation, her phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at the screen and felt her heart skip. It was from Phil Most. "Hope your day is going well. Building maintenance may need to check the HVAC system in 15B this afternoon, if that's convenient. PM." Something about seeing Phil's name made the suffocating atmosphere around Bradford feel less oppressive. Phil Most, who'd given them that beautiful apartment without expecting anything in return. Phil Most, who'd crouched down to listen seriously to Jasim's requirements for nice men. Phil Most, whose dark eyes had held genuine concern when he'd looked at her, like she was something precious worth protecting. Personal messages during work hours? Bradford's voice had developed a sharp edge that made her skin prickle with alarm. How unprofessional. Building maintenance, Natasha said coolly, tucking her phone away. My landlord ensuring the property is properly maintained. Your landlord? Bradford's eyebrows rose with interest that made Natasha immediately regret sharing even that small detail. Anyone I might know. Miami real estate is such a intimate community. I doubt it, Natasha lied smoothly, every instinct screaming at her to protect Phil's name from Bradford's toxic interest. Bradford studied her face for a long moment, his pale blue eyes cataloging every micro-expression like data to be analyzed later. Finally, he stood with fluid grace, smoothing his tie with the kind of casual arrogance that spoke of absolute confidence in his eventual victory. Well, we should finish this conversation somewhere more. Private, he said, the words feeling like spider silk wrapping around her throat. My office, perhaps. Say 6 o'clock, after most of the staff has gone home for the evening. It wasn't a request, it was a summons wrapped in the illusion of choice. I have to pick up my daughter from after-school care by 6, Natasha said, grasping for any excuse that might save her from being alone with him. 7, then. Bradford's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. I'm sure you can arrange alternate childcare for one evening. Consider it mandatory professional development. He walked away before she could respond, leaving behind the cloying scent of his cologne and the oppressive weight of his expectations. Natasha stared at the roses, those beautiful, terrible symbols of his intention, and felt the walls of her carefully constructed new life beginning to crumble around her. Her hands were shaking as she reached for her phone. 4 floors above Morrison Financial, Phil Most was attempting to focus on acquisition reports when Savannah appeared in his doorway wearing an expression he'd learned to recognize as trouble approaching from the east. Sir? Her voice carried the kind of careful neutrality that meant she was about to deliver news he wouldn't like. You asked me to let you know if anything seemed concerning about our new tenant in 15B? Phil's attention snapped from his computer screen to his assistant's worried face with the focus of a laser beam. What kind of concerning? She called about maintenance access for this afternoon, Savannah said carefully, choosing her words like stepping stones across dangerous water. Perfectly normal request, except... She paused, her southern upbringing making her reluctant to speak ill without concrete evidence. She sounded scared, Mr. Most, not inconvenienced or annoyed like most tenants would be about unexpected maintenance. Scared. Phil was on his feet before Savannah finished speaking, his expensive Italian leather chair spinning behind him like a discarded thought. Scared how? Like someone who's trying very hard to sound normal when nothing about their situation is normal. Savannah's voice carried the intuitive understanding of a woman who recognized another woman in distress. She asked 3 times if you would be conducting the inspection personally, sir, with emphasis on personally. And I assured her that you would handle it yourself, but Savannah's expression darkened with concern. Why would a tenant specifically need to know that unless they're worried about who else might show up? Unless they need to be certain they'll be safe. Phil grabbed his suit jacket, his mind already racing through possibilities he didn't like, scenarios that made his protective instincts roar to life like sleeping dragons awakened by the scent of smoke. Cancel my 4 o'clock, he said grimly. Already done, sir. Savannah's efficiency was one of the many reasons he'd doubled her salary over the years. And Mr. Most? Trust your instincts on this one. At exactly 4:15 p.m., Phil stood outside apartment 15B, listening to the sound of muffled crying through the solid wood door. Not the dramatic sobbing of someone seeking attention, but the quiet, heartbroken weeping of someone trying desperately not to be heard, trying not to burden the world with their pain. The sound hit him like a physical blow, triggering protective instincts he hadn't known he possessed. He knocked gently, carefully. "Miss Barrage, it's Phil Most." The crying stopped abruptly, followed by the sound of rapid movement, running water, hurried footsteps, the rustle of tissues, and the quick application of makeup designed to hide evidence of tears. When the door opened 2 minutes later, Natasha had clearly tried to repair the damage, but her golden brown eyes were still red-rimmed and her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed her hair. "Mr. Most," she said with forced brightness that didn't fool him for a second. "Thank you for coming personally. I know you must be terribly busy with more important matters." "Are you all right?" Phil asked quietly, studying her face with growing concern. There were shadows under her eyes that hadn't been there 3 weeks ago, and something fragile in her posture that made him want to wrap her in protective arms and demand to know who had hurt her. Of course. The lie was automatic, practiced, polished smooth by repetition. "Just a long day at work. You know how it is in the corporate world." Phil didn't know how it was, actually. He'd built his empire specifically, so he'd never have to know what it felt like to be powerless, vulnerable, or afraid in a professional setting. But looking at Natasha's carefully constructed mask, he found himself wanting to tear down whatever was threatening her with his bare hands. "Where's Jasim?" "After-school program until 6, Natasha said, stepping aside to let him enter. "She's learning to swim in their pool. She absolutely loves it. Keeps talking about being a mermaid when she grows up." Phil nodded, making a mental note to ask about the swimming program later, but his attention was caught by the subtle changes in the apartment. Natasha had transformed the space into something that whispered of home. A colorful throw blanket draped over the sofa. Jasim's artwork arranged on the refrigerator with the precision of a museum curator. Fresh flowers in a simple glass vase that made his expensive designer furniture look ostentatious by comparison. "You've made this place beautiful," he said honestly, meaning every word. For the first time since he'd arrived, Natasha's smile reached her eyes. Jasim picked out most of the decorations. She has very strong opinions about color coordination and the proper placement of stuffed animals. Smart girl. Phil moved toward the HVAC unit, though they both knew it was working perfectly. "How's the new job treating you?" "Morrison Financial has quite the reputation in Miami." The question was casual, conversational, but Phil watched her carefully from the corner of his eye. Natasha's shoulders tensed almost imperceptibly, and when she spoke, her voice carried that same forced brightness that had greeted him at the door. "It's challenging," she said carefully, the words chosen with the precision of someone navigating a minefield. "Lots of opportunities for professional growth and development." There it was, that carefully neutral phrasing that set every alarm bell in his head, clanging like church bells on Sunday morning. Someone was making Natasha Barrage feel unsafe in her workplace, and Phil was going to find out who. "Good," he said mildly, making a show of checking perfectly functioning vents while his mind catalogued every micro-expression, every careful word choice, every sign that the woman he was rapidly falling for was in trouble. "You deserve opportunities that match your considerable talents." When he turned back to face her, Natasha was staring at him with an expression caught between gratitude and confusion, as if kindness was so foreign she didn't quite know how to receive it without suspicion. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion she was trying hard to suppress. "For saying that. For everything, really." Phil stepped closer, close enough to catch that hint of vanilla that seemed to follow her everywhere, close enough to see the golden flecks in her eyes that made him think of sunrise over Biscayne Bay. "Natasha?" His voice was gentle, careful, the tone he might use with a wounded animal. "Yes." If you ever need anything, anything at all, you have my direct number. Day or night, weekends, holidays. It doesn't matter what time it is or how trivial it might seem. If you need help, you call me." Their eyes held for a moment that stretched too long and not long enough, and Phil found himself drowning in the depth of emotion he saw there. Gratitude and fear, and something that might have been hope if she dared to let herself believe in it. "I should go," he said reluctantly, though every instinct screamed at him to stay, to keep her talking until she told him what was wrong, to plant himself between her and whatever was causing those shadows under her eyes. "But the HVAC system is working perfectly. No problems at all." As he reached the door, Natasha's voice stopped him. "Mr. Most? Phil?" He turned back. "Thank you for checking personally. It It means more than you know." Phil walked back to his elevator with Natasha's haunted expression burned into his memory and a growing certainty that someone was going to pay for putting fear in those beautiful eyes. The Miami afternoon was painting itself in shades of amber and gold, and the city sprawled beneath him like a jewel-toned promise. This was his kingdom, the empire he'd built from nothing but ambition and an unshakable belief that he could create something better than what he'd been given. But looking back toward the windows of 15B, where Natasha was probably still trying to convince herself that everything was fine, Phil realized that his empire meant nothing if he couldn't protect the people who mattered. And Natasha Berridge, with her quiet dignity and fierce love for her daughter, her golden brown eyes and vanilla scent, had somehow become the person who mattered most. He just had to figure out who was threatening her. And when he did, they were going to learn what happened when someone made the mistake of targeting Phil Most's family. Chapter 3. Thunder Before the Storm. Bradford Kellaway's hands were on Natasha before she could scream, and in that terrifying moment she realized that every woman who'd whispered warnings about him had been trying to save her life. "Finally alone," he breathed against her neck, trapping her between his body and the conference room door he'd just locked. The Morrison financial offices were empty except for security and cleaning crew, exactly as Bradford had planned when he'd insisted on this mandatory performance review. The conference room felt like a trap, its windows offering views of Miami's skyline that might as well have been another planet. The polished table reflected dim lighting like a dark mirror, and leather chairs stood like silent witnesses to Bradford's intentions. "Mr. Kellaway, please." Natasha tried to twist away, but his grip tightened with bruising force. "Bradford," he corrected, voice thick with entitlement. His breath carried traces of expensive scotch, liquid courage for what he'd been planning. "We're past formalities now, sweetheart." Natasha's mind raced through escape routes. Security was too far away. Her phone was across the room, Bradford's body pressed against hers with predatory intent that made her stomach revolt. "You don't understand," she said desperately. "I have a daughter. She's waiting for me." "Jassim," Bradford said with casual cruelty that made Natasha's blood freeze in her veins, each word precisely calculated for maximum psychological damage. 5 years old, attends Palmetto Elementary's extended day program until 7 p.m. sharp. Bright little thing from what I hear. Loves to draw pictures of families. Asked her teacher just last week why some kids have daddies and others don't. Room 15, B at Coral Heights. Corner unit with the bay view. Quite the upgrade from wherever you were living before. The threat was crystal clear, delivered with the kind of smile that belonged in horror movies. Bradford hadn't just been harassing her. He'd been watching them, studying their routines with the methodical patience of a predator who understood that knowledge was power. He knew Jassim's schedule, their address, probably even her daughter's favorite teacher's name. He'd been building a psychological profile designed to identify every pressure point, every vulnerability, every weakness he could exploit to ensure Natasha's complete capitulation. Please, she whispered, hating herself for begging, but knowing she'd do anything for Jassim's safety. Don't involve her in this. That's entirely up to you, Bradford murmured, tracing her cheek with mock tenderness. Be smart, Natasha. You're a single mother with no support system, working in a field where my recommendations carry weight. Do you really want to make this difficult? For a moment, Natasha felt herself fracturing under his threats. She thought of Jassim's gap-toothed smile, their perfect apartment, the fragile security they'd finally found. Was she willing to risk all of that for the principle of saying no? Then Bradford leaned in to kiss her, his breath hot and entitled against her lips, his hands roaming her body like she was property he'd already purchased, and something fierce and protective roared to life in Natasha's chest with the force of a hurricane making landfall. She thought of Phil, most crouching down to listen seriously to Jassim's requirements for nice men, treating a 5-year-old's wisdom with the respect it deserved. She thought of the way he'd looked at her, not like prey to be hunted, but like someone worthy of respect, someone deserving of protection and care. She thought of the woman she wanted Jassim to become, and the example she was setting in this moment that would echo through her daughter's understanding of what women should and shouldn't accept from the world. She thought of every woman who'd whispered warnings in bathroom mirrors, every victim who'd been silenced by shame and fear, every little girl who deserved to inherit a world where monsters in expensive suits couldn't buy their way out of consequences. No, she said clearly, her voice carrying 6 years of suppressed fury and maternal protectiveness, and slapped Bradford across the face with every ounce of strength she possessed. The crack echoed through the conference room like a gunshot. Bradford staggered back, his facade cracking to reveal ugly reality beneath. "You little bitch," he snarled, hand flying to his reddening cheek. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" "I've done what I should have done weeks ago," Natasha said, voice steadier than she felt. "I'm reporting this to HR first thing tomorrow." Bradford's laugh was cold enough to freeze blood. "HR? Oh, sweetheart, you really don't understand how this works." He straightened his tie with deliberate calm. "Who do you think they'll believe? Me, with 15 years of exemplary service, or you, a desperate single mother who obviously seduced her supervisor and cried assault when rejected?" The truth hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't impulse. This was a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to isolate and destroy her. "That's not what happened, isn't it?" His smile was sharp as a blade. "You wore that tight red dress yesterday, accepted my gifts, came to my office after hours, alone." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Your word against mine, and we both know whose carries more weight." Bradford moved to the door, unlocking it with casual arrogance. "Think very carefully about your next move, because if you breathe one word of this to anyone, I'll make sure you never work in finance again. Anywhere. And then what happens to little Jassim when mommy can't afford that nice apartment?" 3 hours later, Natasha sat on her bathroom floor, holding Jassim while they both cried, and she wondered how she'd ever believed they could escape powerlessness. The apartment that had felt like sanctuary now felt like a beautiful cage. Even the roses, now wilting in her trash, seemed to mock her with their dying beauty. "Mommy, why are you sad?" Jassim asked, small hands patting Natasha's wet cheeks. "Did the mean people at work hurt your feelings again?" Again, as if her 5-year-old had already learned to expect cruelty. The thought made Natasha weep harder. "Just grown-up problems, baby," Natasha whispered, holding Jassim closer. "Nothing for you to worry about." But it was everything to worry about. Bradford's threats echoed like a death knell. "Your word against mine. Never work again. What happens to little Jassim?" Jassim pulled back to study her mother's face with childhood seriousness. "Maybe the nice man could help," she suggested with innocent hope. He fixes things when they break, remember? And you're kinda broken right now, Mommy. The nice man, Phil Most, who'd given them this apartment and looked at her like she was worth protecting. Phil Most, who lived in a world where problems could be solved with power and influence. Some things are too broken to fix, sweetheart, Natasha said softly. Nothing's too broken for the nice man, Jassim insisted with fierce certainty. He has kind eyes, Mommy, and kind eyes fix everything. That's what Daddy Jackson used to tell you, remember? Daddy Jackson. Natasha's throat closed with sudden emotion as she remembered her brother's phrase. Kind eyes see the hurt and heal it, baby girl. Phil Most had kind eyes. Maybe Jassim was right. Maybe some things weren't too broken to fix. Maybe she didn't have to face this alone. 4 floors above, Phil Most paced his penthouse like a caged wolf, every protective instinct screaming that something was desperately wrong. He'd heard them crying. The sound had drifted up through the building's ventilation. Not normal domestic life, but genuine distress. A woman trying to muffle her sobs, a child asking heartbreaking questions about why Mommy was sad. Phil had built his empire by trusting his instincts, and every instinct told him Natasha Barrage was in real trouble, the kind that wouldn't be solved with money or legal documents alone. He'd stood by his windows for an hour, watching the lights of 15B and fighting the urge to knock on her door and demand answers. But what right did he have? He was her landlord, not her protector. They barely knew each other. Except that wasn't entirely true. Something had sparked between them from that first rain-soaked meeting. When she'd looked at him with those golden brown eyes full of carefully guarded hope, he'd felt his carefully ordered world shift in ways that defied logic. And now someone was making her cry. Someone was threatening the fragile happiness she'd built for herself and her daughter. His phone lay on the marble counter like an accusation. He could text her, ask if everything was okay. But what if whoever was threatening her had access to her phone? What if reaching out made things worse? Instead, he found himself dialing Savannah's number. "I need you to do something for me," he said without preamble. "Of course, Mr. Most. What do you need?" "I want you to find out everything you can about Morrison Financial Group, staff, management, any complaints or lawsuits in the past 5 years. Pay particular attention to workplace harassment issues." The line was quiet for a moment. "Any particular reason for this interest, sir?" Phil looked toward the windows facing Coral Heights, where Natasha and Jassim were somewhere in the darkness, and felt something fierce and protective settle in his chest. "Someone's threatening one of our tenants," he said quietly. "And I'm going to find out who. How deep do you want me to dig?" "As deep as it takes," Phil said, his voice carrying steel that had built empires. "And Savannah, this is priority 1. Everything else can wait." After he hung up, Phil stood at his window and made a silent promise to the woman 4 floors below, who changed his world with golden brown eyes and quiet dignity. Whatever was hunting Natasha Barrage had just painted a target on the wrong family. And Phil Most had never lost a war that mattered. Chapter 4. When Walls Come Crashing Down. The cardboard box containing 6 months of Natasha's professional life weighed nothing compared to the crushing weight of Bradford Kellaway's lies. But she carried both out of Morrison Financial, knowing that some betrayals cut so deep they reshape your soul. Sexual harassment of a superior, the HR representative had intoned with clinical detachment. Multiple witnesses report inappropriate behavior toward Mr. Kellaway. Termination effective immediately, with cause. Multiple witnesses. Bradford had been busy overnight weaving deception with master manipulator skill. Her co-workers, people she'd shared coffee with, trusted with confidences, had developed selective amnesia about Bradford's behavior while manufacturing detailed memories of her supposed advances. In Bradford's version, she was the predator, a desperate single mother who'd tried to seduce her way to advancement and turned vindictive when rejected. The narrative was perfectly crafted to exploit every prejudice about women like her. The Miami morning blazed outside her taxi with relentless optimism that made her situation feel surreal. Coconut palms swayed in the breeze, joggers swept past in designer athletic wear. The Miami of tourism brochures that had nothing to do with women like her getting destroyed by men like Bradford. Her phone buzzed. Reminder, art supplies and $15 due Friday for Mother's Day project. Minus Miss Foster. $15. Such a small amount, but it might as well have been 15,000. How could she explain to Jassim that she couldn't afford construction paper because Mommy had been fired for fighting off a predator? The taxi pulled up to Coral Heights, and Natasha stared up at the building that had represented hope just hours ago. Now it loomed like a monument to dreams she couldn't afford. She had to tell Phil most she could no longer afford rent. Had to explain that the apartment where Jassim had started calling home was just another temporary stop. Had to disappoint him the way she seemed to disappoint everyone foolish enough to believe in her. Phil most answered his penthouse door on the second knock, and Natasha's composure crumbled at the sight of him. His dark hair was disheveled, his shirt wrinkled, and his eyes held concern that made her heart skip with something dangerously close to hope. "Natasha," he said, and the relief in his voice was so profound she almost started crying. "Thank God, I've been worried sick." The simple admission undid her. In a world where Bradford's lies had turned colleagues into enemies, here was someone who'd been worried about her. "I need to talk to you," she said, voice steady despite the chaos in her chest. "About my lease." Something dark flickered across Phil's features. "Come in, please." His penthouse whispered of understated luxury, but it was the genuine concern in his eyes that made the space feel warm instead of intimidating. "Sit," he said gently. "Can I get you something?" "I can't stay long," Natasha said, perching on the sofa edge like a bird ready to flee. "I wanted to give you proper notice that I'll be vacating 15B at the end of the month." Phil went very still. "Why?" The simple question broke through her defenses. She'd expected demands for explanations, concerns about finding another tenant. She hadn't expected the quiet devastation in his voice. "I lost my job," she said simply, focusing on her hands. "I can't afford rent anymore." What happened? And suddenly, without knowing how, the whole horrible story poured out. Bradford's harassment, the escalating threats, the trap in the conference room, and finally the twisted accusations that had destroyed her reputation in one stroke. She told him about the roses that had been warnings, about colleagues who developed selective amnesia, about the system designed to protect predators and destroy victims. "He made it look like I was the aggressor," she finished, voice hollow. "Said I was trying to seduce him for advancement. By the time HR finished investigating, I was a predator and he was the victim." Phil had gone absolutely motionless during her recitation, jaw clenched so tightly she could see muscles jumping beneath his skin. When she finished, the silence crackled with dangerous energy. "His name," Phil said, voice deadly quiet. "I want his full name." "Phil, you can't—" "His name." The words carried authority that had built empires and destroyed competitors. "Bradford Kellaway," she whispered, and watched something dark and predatory settle in Phil's expression. "Good," he said with satisfaction that made her shiver. "Now we're going to fix this." Natasha shook her head desperately. "You don't understand. It's done. He destroyed my reputation, my references. No one will hire someone accused of sexual harassment. I have to start over somewhere else." "No," Phil said with absolute certainty. "You don't. Phil, do you trust me?" The question stopped her mid-protest. Did she trust him? This man who'd waived fees for a stranger, who'd given them the most beautiful home they'd ever known, who was looking at her now like she was worth fighting wars for. "I barely know you," she said honestly, "but do you trust me?" Natasha looked into his dark eyes and saw something that made her breath catch. Not pity or charity, but genuine caring. The kind of protective instinct she'd only dreamed of inspiring. "Yes," she whispered, "I trust you." "Then don't give up your apartment. Don't uproot Jassim again. Let me handle Bradford Kellaway. You can't just—" "Natasha," Phil interrupted gently, moving to sit beside her. "Do you know what I do for a living?" She blinked at the unexpected question. "Real estate development. Among other things." His smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "I also happen to be a silent investor in Morrison Financial Group." The words hit her like a physical blow. "What?" "I've been a silent investor for 3 years," Phil said calmly. "Which means I have access to personnel files, security footage, and the authority to launch full investigations into employee conduct." Natasha stared in shock. You're Bradford's boss." "Several levels removed, but yes." Phil's voice carried quiet authority. "And if Bradford Kellaway thinks he can destroy innocent women to cover his crimes, he's about to learn what real consequences look like." "Phil, I don't want charity." "This isn't charity," he said firmly. "This is justice, and more than that." He reached out to touch her hand, fingers warm and steady. "This is personal." "Personal?" Phil's eyes searched her face with intensity that made her heart race. "You and Jassim, you've become important to me, more important than I probably have any right to claim. The thought of someone hurting you, threatening you—" His jaw clenched. "Bradford Kellaway picked the wrong woman to target." Natasha felt something shift in her chest, warmth spreading through the cold fear that had dominated her since yesterday. "Why?" she whispered. "Why do you care?" Phil was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing gentle patterns across her knuckles. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "Because you're extraordinary," he said simply. "Because you've faced impossible odds with more grace and strength than anyone should have to possess. Because your daughter draws pictures of us as a family, and somehow that feels more right than anything in my perfectly planned life ever has." Tears she'd been holding back finally spilled over. "Phil, let me help you," he said urgently. "Let me fix this. Not because you can't handle it yourself, but because no one should have to fight monsters alone." Natasha looked into his dark eyes and saw her future. Not the desperate scramble for survival she'd been expecting, but something beautiful and protected and worth believing in. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay." Phil's smile was brilliant enough to power the city. "Good. Now, why don't you call Jassim's school and tell them she'll definitely be participating in that Mother's Day project?" "How did you—" "I pay attention," Phil said softly. "And Natasha?" "Bradford Kellaway has no idea what's about to hit him." As Natasha settled back against the sofa cushions, feeling safe for the first time in days, she found herself believing that maybe the nice man with kind eyes really could fix everything after all. The war for her future was far from over, but for the first time she wasn't fighting it alone. Chapter 5. The Truth That Changes Everything. The photograph hidden in Natasha's wallet had been her secret weapon against despair for 6 years. But when Phil Most saw his best friend's face staring back at him from the faded image, it became the key that unlocked everything she'd been too afraid to tell him. "I should go," Natasha said, rising from Phil's sofa with careful dignity. The afternoon light streaming through his penthouse windows caught the gold threads in her hair, transforming her into something ethereal despite the earthly troubles that had brought her here. "Jassim will be home soon, and I need to figure out how to explain why I was home early." "Wait," Phil said gently, something in her nervous energy making him reluctant to let her go. The revelation about Morrison Financial had shifted dynamics between them, but he sensed deeper currents still unexplored. You mentioned that Jasim's father isn't in the picture, if you don't mind me asking. Natasha's hand tightened on her purse strap, knuckles showing white against worn leather. He was never really in the picture to begin with. Jasim's father died before she was born. I'm sorry, Phil said automatically, but something about her careful phrasing nagged at him. That must have been incredibly difficult. I wasn't with him when he died, Natasha said quietly, golden brown eyes distant with old pain. We'd had a falling out before I knew I was pregnant. By the time I found out about Jasim, it was too late to tell him. Phil studied her profile as she stared out at Biscayne Bay, noting the way her fingers worried at her wallet's worn edge. What was his name? He asked softly. Natasha was quiet for so long, Phil thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Jackson Barrage. The name hit Phil like a physical blow, stealing breath from his lungs and making the world tilt sideways. Jackson Barrage, his college roommate, business partner, and closest friend. The man whose funeral he'd spoken at 6 years ago with tears streaming down his face. Jackson Barrage, Phil repeated slowly. Natasha's head snapped up, eyes wide with surprise. Did you know him? Phil stared at her, really looked at her for the first time since she'd mentioned the name. The elegant cheekbones that reminded him of someone he couldn't place, the way she carried herself with quiet pride that felt achingly familiar, the fierce protectiveness when it came to Jasim that echoed something from his past. And then it hit him like lightning illuminating a dark landscape. The graduation photo Jackson had carried in his wallet, a young woman in cap and gown, radiant with achievement. The way Jackson's voice had softened whenever he talked about his little sister who was going to change the world. The pride that had made Jackson's eyes shine when he'd shown off her scholarship letter, her dean's list certificates, her plans to revolutionize municipal finance. You're Tasha, Phil said with dawning realization that felt like the universe clicking into perfect alignment. Jackson's daughter, his brilliant little sister. He talked about you constantly, how proud he was when you got your finance degree, how you were going to show those stuffy old men in government finance how it should really be done. Natasha's face went pale. He talked about me? All the time, Phil said, voice thick with emotion as memories flooded back. Jackson at 21 showing off wallet photos. Jackson at 24 beaming with pride over Natasha's scholarship. Jackson at 26 worried sick about their fight and planning to drive to Tampa to make things right. A drive he'd never made because he died 3 days before he'd planned to leave. You were studying finance, Phil continued, pieces clicking into place. Planning to change the world one municipal bond at a time. He said you were the smartest person he'd ever known. Phil paused, throat tight. He also said you two had a fight before graduation. Something about him dating your roommate. Tears spilled down Natasha's cheeks. Monica, she whispered. I thought he was just using her, that he was going to hurt her. We said terrible things. I told him I never wanted to see him again. Phil's heart broke for the pain in her voice. He regretted that fight every day, Tasha. He used to say it was his biggest mistake, letting pride keep him from reaching out. I was pregnant, Natasha said brokenly, the words tumbling out like a dam bursting after years of holding back floodwaters. I found out 2 weeks after graduation. I sat in that little clinic bathroom staring at the test, and the first person I wanted to call was Jackson. I wanted to hear him say everything would be okay, that he'd help me figure out how to be a mother when I could barely take care of myself. She wiped her eyes with trembling hands, lost in the memory of that terrifying, lonely moment. I tried calling him, but his number was disconnected. I drove to his old apartment, but he'd moved. I was too proud to ask his friends where he'd gone, too hurt to keep chasing someone who obviously didn't want me in his life anymore. He changed his number because Monica kept calling, Phil said gently. The breakup was ugly, and he didn't want her having access. He never knew you'd tried to reach him. Phil remembered those months after graduation. Jackson throwing himself into work with manic intensity, starting the real estate ventures that would make them both wealthy. He'd dated sporadically, but never seriously, always saying he needed to fix things with his sister first. The car accident, Phil said suddenly. 6 years ago. You said Jasim's father died before she was born, but Jackson died when she was 6 months old. Natasha's composure cracked completely. Jackson died without knowing about her, she sobbed. I kept meaning to reach out to tell him he had a niece, but I was scared he'd reject us both. Then I saw the news about the accident, and it was too late. Phil felt like he was drowning in revelations. Jackson had died without knowing he was an uncle. Jasim was Jackson's niece, the family Phil had promised his best friend he'd always protect if Jackson ever had one. My God, Phil whispered, moving to kneel in front of Natasha's chair. You've been alone all this time, raising Jasim, struggling to survive, and you were Jackson's family. I'm not anyone's family, Natasha said through tears. I'm just someone who made too many mistakes. No, Phil said fiercely, taking her hands in his. You're Jackson Berridge's daughter. You're Jasim's mother. You're... He paused, heart hammering as he realized what she meant to him. You're the woman I've been falling in love with since the moment you walked into my building. Natasha's eyes went wide. Phil... Jackson made me promise, Phil continued urgently. The night before he died, we were talking about the future, about building something lasting. He said if anything ever happened to him, I should take care of the people who mattered. I told him he was being morbid. Phil's voice broke. I failed him, Tasha. I let you struggle alone when I should have been protecting you. You didn't know. I should have looked harder, Phil said with self-recrimination. Jackson talked about you so much. I should have put the pieces together. Your name, your age, the way you carry yourself. Natasha pulled her hands free to frame his face, touch gentle despite her tears. You can't blame yourself for not finding someone who didn't want to be found. I was too proud, too hurt, too scared. Phil leaned into her touch, overwhelmed by what had shifted between them. Jasim, he said suddenly. She's Jackson's niece. No wonder she felt familiar. She has his smile. She does, Natasha agreed softly. Sometimes I look at her and see him so clearly. It takes my breath away. Does she know? About Jackson? I've told her stories about Uncle Jackson, the brother I loved very much, but I couldn't tell her he was family when I wasn't sure he would have wanted us. Phil's heart broke again. He would have loved her, he said with absolute certainty, and he would have been so proud of the mother you've become. They sat in silence, the weight of 6 years of missed connections settling between them. Finally, Phil spoke again. There's something else, he said carefully. Something you need to know about the apartment. Natasha tensed. What do you mean? The building, Phil said softly. Coral Heights. Jackson and I designed it together. It was going to be his flagship property. We broke ground 3 weeks before he died. Natasha's face went white. You mean, you've been living in Jackson's building, Phil said gently, his voice filled with wonder at the cosmic poetry of it all. The apartment you fell in love with, the place where Jasim draws pictures and calls home. Jackson planned every single detail of it. The reading nook by the master bedroom window. That was his idea. He said every home should have a place where families could make memories that would last forever. Phil's voice grew thick with emotion as the memories flooded back. He spent hours sketching the layouts, arguing with architects about the perfect placement of windows to catch morning light. He wanted the kitchen islands positioned so parents could help with homework while cooking dinner. Even the height of the bathroom counters was designed with children in mind. He said kids should be able to brush their teeth without needing a step stool by the time they were Jasim's age. "Oh God," Natasha whispered. "It's like he's been watching over us." "Maybe he has," Phil said, reaching for a framed photo from his desk. The image showed two young men grinning at the camera, arms around each other's shoulders with easy camaraderie. "Maybe that's why you found your way here to me." "That's him," Natasha breathed, touching Jackson's face in the photo. "He looks so young, so happy." "He was," Phil said, "especially when he talked about you, his brilliant little sister who was going to take over the financial world." Natasha looked up at Phil with eyes full of wonder and pain, and something that might have been hope. "What happens now?" Phil sat beside her again, close enough to see the gold flecks in her eyes that reminded him so much of Jackson's. "Now I keep the promise I should have kept 6 years ago. I take care of Jackson's family." "Phil, I don't want charity." "This isn't charity," Phil interrupted gently. "This is family. You and Jasim. You're my family now. Not just because of Jackson, but because—" He cupped her face in his hands. "Because I love you, Tasha. I'm in love with you, and I want to spend the rest of my life making sure you never have to face anything alone again." "I love you too," she whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. "I've been trying not to, but I love you too." When Phil kissed her, soft and reverent and full of promise, it felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering in the wilderness. It felt like Jackson's final gift, a love that had been waiting 6 years to unfold, guided by invisible hands that had brought them together when they were finally ready to heal each other's hearts. The kiss tasted of salt tears and new beginnings, of grief transformed into gratitude, and loneliness dissolved into belonging. When they finally broke apart, both breathing unsteadily, Phil rested his forehead against hers with infinite tenderness. And somewhere in the distance, carried on the Miami breeze, Natasha could have sworn she heard her brother's laughter, finally at peace. Chapter 6. Dangerous territory of the heart. Watching Phil. Most teach her daughter to ride a bicycle in the Coral Heights courtyard while Miami sunset painted the sky in rose and gold. Natasha realized that falling in love with him had been the easy part. Learning to accept that she deserved this happiness might destroy her. 3 weeks had passed since the revelation about Jackson. 3 weeks of Phil quietly dismantling Bradford Kellaway's lies while building something beautiful and terrifying with her and Jasim. He'd insisted she stay rent-free while he handled the situation. And despite her protests about charity, Natasha found herself too grateful for stability to fight him. "I'm doing it, Mommy. Look, I'm really doing it." Jasim's voice carried pure joy as she wobbled down the path on her bright pink bicycle, training wheels abandoned in favor of Phil's steady hand. "She's a natural," Phil called out, jogging alongside with his suit jacket discarded and white shirt rolled up. The afternoon sun highlighted his shoulders, and Natasha felt that familiar flutter that had become constant in his presence. "Just like her uncle," Natasha murmured, remembering Jackson teaching her to ride when she was 7. Phil caught her words and smiled warmly. Over the past weeks, he'd been collecting every Jackson story like precious artifacts, rebuilding their lost friendship through her memories. "Uncle Phil, watch this!" Jasim shouted, attempting a turn that sent her wobbling toward the fountain. "Easy there, speed demon," Phil laughed, steadying the bike with gentle hands. "Save the trick riding for when you've mastered the basics." Uncle Phil. The title had emerged naturally 2 weeks ago, and Phil had accepted it with such pleasure that Natasha's heart had done dangerous things in her chest. "Dinner's almost ready," Natasha called reluctantly. 5 more minutes, then we need to wash up. Can Uncle Phil stay for dinner? Jassim asked hopefully. I made him a picture of our family for his office. Phil had been joining them for dinner almost every evening, and the domestic intimacy was becoming dangerously addictive. She kept waiting for him to grow tired of playing house, but instead he seemed to settle deeper into their routine each day. If he wants to, Natasha said carefully. I want to, Phil said without hesitation, dark eyes holding hers with intensity that made her pulse skip. I always want to. An hour later, Natasha stood at her kitchen sink, watching Phil help Jassim with math homework at the breakfast bar, trying to reconcile this tender, patient man with the billionaire who commanded boardrooms and built empires. If Tommy has 12 apples and gives away 4, how many does he have left? Phil asked seriously. 8, Jassim announced proudly. But why would Tommy give away his apples? Maybe he likes making his friends happy more than keeping them for himself, Phil suggested gently. Sometimes giving things away makes us feel richer. Like how you gave us the pretty apartment, Jassim asked with devastating innocence. Phil's eyes found Natasha's across the kitchen. Exactly like that, sweetheart. Natasha felt her throat tighten with emotion. Phil had given them so much more than an apartment. He'd given them safety, stability, and the first taste of family either she or Jassim had ever known. The weight of his generosity terrified her almost as much as her growing dependence on his presence. I should start Jassim's bath, she said, needing distance from the overwhelming domesticity. Can Uncle Phil read my bedtime story tonight? Jassim asked hopefully. He does the best voices for the princess book. If that's okay with your mom, Phil said, but his eyes were asking for more than permission to read a story. Of course, Natasha managed. After Jassim was bathed, storied, and tucked into bed with promises of more bicycle lessons tomorrow, Natasha found Phil cleaning her kitchen with focused attention. You don't have to do that, she protested, but Phil just smiled and continued loading her dishwasher. I want to, he said simply. Besides, someone very wise once told me that good men should know how to fix things when they break. I'm expanding that to include dishes. Natasha leaned against the counter, watching his efficient movements and trying to memorize this moment. Phil Most, billionaire developer, wearing her apron and humming softly while he cleaned her kitchen. Preston called today, Phil said casually, but Natasha caught the undercurrent of satisfaction. He's found some very interesting information about Bradford Kellaway. Preston Ward was Phil's lawyer, investigating Bradford's history with thorough attention. Natasha had met him twice, and he'd treated her assault with serious professionalism she'd been denied at Morrison Financial. What kind of information? She asked. The kind that shows you weren't his first victim, Phil said grimly. Preston's found 3 other women who've filed complaints against Bradford over the past 5 years. All buried by HR, all victims quietly transferred or terminated. Natasha felt a chill. 3 others? 3 that we know of, Phil corrected. Preston thinks there might be more who never came forward. Bradford's father has significant influence in Miami financial circles, enough to keep scandals quiet. The mention of Bradford's family connections made Natasha's stomach twist. Phil, maybe we should just let this go, if his family has that kind of power. No, Phil's voice carried steely determination that had built his empire. He hurt you. He threatened Jassim. He's been terrorizing women for years and counting on their silence. Phil turned to face her fully. I won't let him get away with it. But what if he retaliates? What if he comes after us? Phil crossed the kitchen in 2 strides, gently framing her face with hands that still smelled like dish soap. He can't touch you anymore, Tasha. You're under my protection now, and I have resources he can't match. "This isn't your fight," Natasha whispered, even as she leaned into his touch. "Yes, it is," Phil said fiercely. "You're mine to protect now, you and Jassim both. Jackson asked me to take care of his family, and I failed him once. I won't fail him again." The possessive certainty in his voice should have alarmed her, but instead it sent heat spiraling through her chest. When had she stopped being afraid of depending on someone? "I love you," she said suddenly, the words escaping without permission. Phil's smile was brilliant enough to power the building. "I love you too," he said, and kissed her with reverent passion that made her forget they were standing in her kitchen. When they finally broke apart, both breathing unsteadily, Phil rested his forehead against hers. "I want to court you properly," he said seriously. "Take you on real dates, bring you flowers, show you how a woman like you deserves to be treated." "Phil, I know the circumstances aren't ideal," he continued urgently. "I know this all happened fast, and I know you're still recovering from what Bradford put you through. But I want you to know my intentions are honorable. I want forever with you, Tasha. Marriage, more children if you want them, growing old together in the building Jackson designed for families like ours." Natasha felt tears prick her eyes. "You want marriage?" "I want everything," Phil said simply. "But only if you want it too. Only when you're ready." Instead of answering with words, Natasha kissed him again, pouring 6 years of loneliness and fear and desperate hope into the connection between them. When Phil responded with matching intensity, lifting her onto the counter and stepping between her knees, she felt something fundamental shift in her chest. This wasn't just physical attraction or emotional comfort. This was coming home to a man who saw her struggles and chose to stay anyway. This was the kind of love Jackson would have wanted for her, protective but not possessive, generous but not patronizing. "I want it too," she whispered against his lips. "All of it, with you." Phil's smile was so radiant it took her breath away. "Good," he said, pressing soft kisses along her jawline. "Because I was hoping you'd say that." "When?" she asked, surprising herself with the question. Phil pulled back to look at her, eyes bright with something that might have been mischief. "Actually," he said carefully, "there's something I should tell you, something I've been carrying around for 2 weeks." "What kind of something?" "The kind that involves adoption papers for Jassim," Phil said gently, watching her face. "If you're willing, I'd like to legally become her father. Make our family official in the eyes of the law." Natasha felt the world tilt with the magnitude of what he was offering. "Phil, I know it's a big step," he continued urgently. "But Tasha, that little girl has been mine from the moment she asked if I was the nice man. I want to be her father in every way possible." "She would love that," Natasha whispered, voice thick with tears. "She asks me almost every day if you're going to stay forever." "What do you tell her?" "I tell her that love makes people want to stay," Natasha said softly. "That when someone really loves you, they don't just disappear." Phil's expression was so tender it made her chest ache. "Smart answer." "What do you tell yourself?" Natasha was quiet for a moment, then smiled with radiance that felt like sunrise. "I tell myself that maybe I finally found my way home." "Not an ending," Phil corrected, spinning her around until she laughed with pure joy. "A beginning. The best kind of beginning." As Miami sparkled below them in the gathering twilight, Phil held the woman he loved and thought about the future they were building together. Bradford Kellaway would face justice. Jassim would have a father who adored her, and Natasha would finally have the security and love she'd been searching for her entire life. It was going to be perfect. Chapter 7: Past Demons and Present Desires. The manila folder Preston Ward placed on Phil's desk contained enough evidence to destroy Bradford Kellaway's life 10 times over. But looking at the photographs of his other victims, Phil wanted to destroy the man himself, with methods that had nothing to do with courtrooms. 4 women total, Preston said, his usually calm voice tight with controlled anger. Sarah Mitchell, 2019, harassed for 6 months, then transferred to Atlanta when she threatened to go public. Brooklyn Pierce, 2020, terminated for performance issues 3 days after filing a complaint. Madison Hayes, 2022, forced to sign an NDA and accept a settlement to avoid what HR termed further complications. Preston paused, jaw clenched with professional fury. And now Natasha. But this time Bradford picked the wrong woman to target. Phil studied the photographs of Bradford's victims, each woman young, beautiful, and clearly vulnerable in some way that had made her easy prey. His hands tightened on the file until his knuckles went white. The pattern is unmistakable, Preston continued, pulling out a timeline that looked like a psychological profile. Bradford specifically targets single mothers or women with financial struggles, anyone who can't afford extended legal battles. His father's political connections have kept everything quiet, but we have enough evidence now to bury him. Good, Phil said with deadly calm. I want him arrested today. I want him perp walked out of Morrison Financial in handcuffs while local news cameras roll. Phil, Natasha's voice from the doorway made both men turn. She stood there in a simple blue dress that made her golden brown eyes glow, but her expression carried careful control she wore like armor when processing trauma. Can I see the file? She asked quietly, moving into Phil's office with deliberate composure. Preston glanced at Phil, who nodded reluctantly. They'd been meeting in his penthouse while Jassim was at swimming lessons, trying to keep uglier details away from innocent ears. But Natasha had insisted on being involved in every decision. Natasha took the folder with steady hands, but Phil watched her face pale as she read through testimonies and saw photographs of women who looked enough like her to be sisters in suffering. When she reached Madison Hayes's statement, a detailed account following the same blueprint as her own experience, her hands began to tremble. He did this to all of them, she whispered, voice carrying hollow quality of someone discovering her personal nightmare was mass-produced horror. Exactly the same pattern, the flowers, the threats about their children, the false accusations designed to destroy credibility before they could speak up. He's a predator who's been protected by money and influence, Phil said, moving to stand beside her chair with protective instinct. But not anymore. This ends now. Natasha looked up at him, eyes bright with tears and something that might have been relief. These women, they'll testify. Sarah and Madison have already agreed, Preston said gently. Brooklyn is still considering, but she's leaning toward yes. They want justice as much as you do. Then we go to the police, Natasha said firmly, chin lifting with determination that had carried her through 6 years of single motherhood. We do this the right way, through proper legal channels. Phil's jaw tightened with effort of controlling impulses that had nothing to do with legal proceedings. The right way takes months, maybe years. Bradford remains free, potentially targeting other women while lawyers argue over procedures. Phil, I have other options, Phil continued, voice carrying the edge that made business competitors afraid. Bradford Kellaway could disappear from Miami entirely. A few words in the right ears about his proclivities, and he'd be unemployable anywhere in the financial sector. That's not justice, Natasha said quietly, voice carrying moral clarity that came from hard experience. That's revenge dressed up as protection. Sometimes they're the same thing, Phil said, control fraying as images of Bradford's hands on Natasha played on repeat in his mind. Natasha stood and faced him fully, chin lifted with quiet determination. I won't let you become someone you're not because of what he did to me. Bradford deserves to face legal consequences for his crimes, not to be driven away in shadows where he might find new hunting grounds. He threatened you, Phil said, voice low and dangerous as careful control finally began to crack. He put his hands on you without permission and tried to destroy your life when you rejected him. He threatened Jassim. And now we have evidence to make sure he pays for all of it, Natasha replied steadily. But we do it legally, Phil. We do it right, so other women can look at our case and know that speaking up is worth the risk. Phil stared at her for a long moment, torn between protective instincts and respect for her unwavering moral compass. Finally, he turned to Preston with resignation that felt like swallowing broken glass. How long for a formal case? With 4 victims willing to testify and documented patterns spanning 5 years. 6 to 8 weeks for charges to be filed, assuming the district attorney takes it seriously, Preston said, professional satisfaction evident. Make sure they take it seriously, Phil said grimly. Already on it, Preston smiled with predatory satisfaction. The DA happens to be particularly interested in prosecuting high-profile sexual assault cases, especially those involving institutional cover-ups. After Preston left with promises to have arrest warrants ready within the week, Phil found Natasha on his balcony overlooking Biscayne Bay, arms wrapped around herself despite the warm Miami afternoon. Regrets? He asked quietly. About what? About pursuing this legally instead of letting me handle it my way. About trusting the system that's already failed you once. Natasha turned to study his face, golden brown eyes searching. Do you regret not being able to destroy him personally? Phil considered lying, but Natasha deserved honesty. Yes, he admitted with brutal self-awareness. Part of me wants to make him disappear completely. The part of me that built an empire from nothing understands that some problems require permanent solutions. I know, she said softly, moving closer until she could place her hands on his chest. I can see it in your eyes when you talk about him, that civilized veneer slipping to reveal something more primitive. But Phil, that's not who you are at your core. You don't know what I'm capable of, Phil said darkly. Yes, I do, Natasha said with quiet certainty, hands moving to frame his face with trust that humbled him. You're capable of incredible gentleness with a 5-year-old who needs a father figure. You're capable of building something beautiful instead of tearing things down. You're capable of loving someone like me, who comes with complications and trauma, and a child who isn't yours by blood, but whom you've claimed anyway. Phil covered her hands with his own. Jassim is mine, he said fiercely. Maybe not by blood, but in every way that counts, and anyone who threatens my family will face justice, Natasha finished, voice carrying gentle steel. Legal, appropriate justice. Because that's what good men do, Phil. They protect their families within the law, not outside it. Phil was quiet for a moment, then pulled her closer until she was pressed against his chest. I've never felt anything like this before, he confessed against her hair. This need to protect you, to make sure nothing ever hurts you again. It's not rational or controlled or civilized. Love isn't supposed to be civilized, Natasha said, voice muffled against his shirt but carrying wisdom. But it's supposed to make us better people, not worse ones. Is that what this is? Phil asked, though his heart already knew the answer. Love? Natasha pulled back to look at him, eyes bright with emotion. I love you, Phil, most. I love your protective instincts and your generous heart and the way you make Jassim laugh. I love how you honor Jackson's memory by taking care of us. But most of all, I love that you're good enough to do the right thing, even when the wrong thing would feel more satisfying. Phil kissed her then, soft and deep and full of promise. When they broke apart, both breathing unsteadily, he rested his forehead against hers. Preston also brought something else today, he said quietly. Natasha went very still. What? Adoption papers for Jassim, Phil said gently, watching her face. If you're willing, I'd like to legally become her father before we get married. Make our family official in every way possible. Tears spilled down Natasha's cheeks. Phil, I know it's fast, he continued urgently. But Tasha, that little girl, has been mine from the moment she asked if I was the nice man. I want to be her father in every legal sense. She'd love that, Natasha whispered. She asks me almost every day if you're her daddy for real now. What do you tell her? I tell her that love makes families, not just blood, Natasha said softly. That when someone chooses to love you, they're saying you're worth keeping. Phil's smile was radiant. Smart answer. And what do you tell yourself? Natasha was quiet for a moment, then smiled with radiance that felt like dawn breaking. I tell myself that maybe Jackson was watching over us all along, making sure we found our way to each other. Not an ending, Phil corrected, spinning her around until she laughed with pure joy. A beginning, the best kind of beginning. As the sun began to set over Biscayne Bay, Phil held the woman he loved and thought about the future they were building together. Bradford Kellaway would face legal consequences. Jassim would have a father who adored her, and Natasha would finally have the security and love she'd been searching for. It was going to be perfect. Chapter 8. When Love Conquers Fear. The sound of Bradford Kellaway's handcuffs clicking shut was the most beautiful music Natasha had ever heard, but watching Phil's fierce satisfaction as the news played on every Miami station made her realize that justice was only the beginning of their love story. Bradford Kellaway, former Morrison financial executive, was arrested this morning on multiple counts of sexual assault and harassment. The news anchor announced over footage of Bradford being led from his Coral Gables mansion in handcuffs, his usual entitled arrogance replaced by hollow-eyed shock. Phil wrapped his arms around Natasha from behind as they watched from his penthouse balcony, the evening news playing on his outdoor television, while Miami glittered below them like a jeweled promise. The warm breeze off Biscayne Bay carried salt and possibility, and for the first time in months, Natasha felt like she could breathe without waiting for the other shoe to drop. How does it feel? Phil asked quietly, voice carrying tender concern that made her fall in love with him all over again. Like I can finally exhale, Natasha admitted, leaning back against his solid warmth. I keep expecting to wake up and find out this was all a dream, that Bradford is still out there with his threats and twisted games. It's real, Phil murmured against her hair, voice carrying absolute certainty. He's going to prison, Tasha. Preston says with 4 victims testifying and the pattern documented, Bradford's looking at 15 to 20 years minimum. His father's political connections mean nothing when faced with overwhelming evidence. The charges had come faster than anyone expected. Once the first victim's story went public through carefully orchestrated media releases, 3 more women had come forward with similar experiences, and the district attorney's office had moved with unprecedented speed. Bradford's father's influence had crumbled overnight when faced with evidence that made cover-ups impossible. The other women, Natasha said, voice thick with gratitude. I want to thank them personally, for being brave enough to speak up, for trusting the system enough to risk their privacy. Preston's arranging a meeting with the ones who are comfortable with it, Phil said, pressing a soft kiss to her head. But Tasha, you were the catalyst. Your courage to fight back made this possible for all of them. Natasha turned in his arms, studying the face that had become dearer to her than breathing. Our courage, she corrected firmly. I couldn't have done this alone. You were never alone, Phil said fiercely, dark eyes blazing with protective love. Not once I found you. Not ever again. The sliding door opened and Jassim emerged wearing her favorite princess pajamas, the pink ones with unicorns that Phil had bought during one of their weekend shopping adventures. Her gap-toothed grin could have powered the building. "Uncle Phil, Mommy, are you watching the bad man go to jail on TV?" she asked with innocent satisfaction that belonged exclusively to children who understood justice in its purest form. "Jassim," Natasha started to protest, but Phil crouched down to the little girl's level with gentle understanding. "Yes, sweetheart," he said seriously. Meeting her eyes with respect, he showed all important people in his life. "The man who hurt Mommy is going to be punished for what he did." "Good," Jassim said with 5-year-old finality. "Bad people should get really long timeouts. That's what happens at school when someone is mean." "That's exactly right," Phil agreed solemnly. "And now Mommy is safe and no one will ever hurt her again." Jassim studied his face with intensity only children possessed, her golden brown eyes bright with trust. "You promise for real? Cross your heart and hope to fly?" "I promise," Phil said without hesitation, making the elaborate crossing gesture Jassim had taught him during bedtime stories. "Cross my heart and hope to fly." Satisfied with this binding oath, Jassim threw her arms around Phil's neck with wholehearted affection that broke Natasha's heart in the best possible way. "I love you, Uncle Phil. Are you gonna be my daddy for real now?" Phil's eyes met Natasha's over Jassim's head, asking permission for something they'd discussed but hadn't yet made official. At Natasha's encouraging nod, he smiled with pure joy. "Would you like that, Princess? For me to be your daddy officially?" "Yes," Jassim squealed, bouncing with excitement. "Then we'd be a real family like the picture I drew, with the same last name and everything." "We're already a real family," Phil said gently, voice thick with emotion. "But yes, I'd be honored to be your daddy officially, with papers and everything." After Jassim was tucked into bed with many kisses and promises of family adventures tomorrow, Natasha found herself standing in her bedroom doorway, suddenly nervous about being alone with Phil in a way she hadn't been before. Tonight felt different. Tonight felt like the beginning of forever. "Second thoughts?" Phil asked softly from behind her, voice carrying none of the pressure she'd learned to expect from men who wanted things from her. "No," she said quickly, then admitted with honesty that had become natural between them. "Maybe. Not about you, about this, United States. I haven't been with anyone since Jackson, and even then." She trailed off, embarrassed. Phil's hands came to rest gently on her shoulders, touch warm and steady and completely without demands. "Even then what?" "I've only been with one person," she said quietly, cheeks burning. "Jackson. And it was just once, the night before our fight. I became pregnant but never got to tell him." She turned to face Phil, eyes bright with tears. "I'm not experienced, Phil. I don't know how to be with someone like you." "Someone like me?" Phil asked, expression softening with tenderness. "Someone sophisticated, worldly, someone who could have anyone, who's probably been with women who knew what they were doing." Phil silenced her with a kiss, so soft and reverent, it felt like worship. "Tasha," he whispered against her lips, "I don't want anyone else. I want you, exactly as you are. But what if I disappoint you? What if I'm not enough? Look at me," Phil said firmly, cupping her face with hands that trembled slightly with restraint. "Do you know what I see when I look at you?" Natasha shook her head, lost in the depth of emotion in his dark eyes. "I see the strongest woman I've ever known," he said, voice rough with sincerity. His thumbs brushed away tears she didn't realize had fallen. "I see the woman I want to spend the rest of my life cherishing." "Phil, we don't have to do anything you're not ready for," he said urgently, voice carrying patience that spoke to a man who understood trust was earned. "We can wait. We can take our time. We have forever, Tasha." Instead of answering with words, Natasha reached up to frame his face with hands that shook slightly with nervousness and anticipation, and love too large for her body to contain. "I love you," she said simply, voice carrying absolute certainty. And I'm tired of being afraid. I'm tired of letting fear make my decisions. What do you want? Phil asked, voice rough with restraint and desire, and something that might have been wonder. You, she said without hesitation. I want you. All of you. Tonight. Phil's kiss this time was different, deeper, hungrier, full of the passion he'd been holding back for months out of respect for her healing and her readiness. When he lifted her off her feet and carried her to the bed with the kind of reverent care usually reserved for precious artifacts, Natasha felt something fundamental shift in her chest. This wasn't just physical desire or emotional comfort. This was coming home to the man who saw her scars and chose to love them, who understood that her inexperience was gift rather than liability. What followed was nothing like her brief encounter with Jackson years ago. Phil worshipped her body with patient reverence, taking time to learn every curve and hollow, every sound that made her gasp with pleasure she'd never imagined possible. His hands moved over her skin like he was memorizing her by touch, his lips following the path his fingers traced, until she felt cherished in ways that rewrote her understanding of intimacy. "You're so beautiful," he whispered against her collarbone, his voice rough with wonder. "Perfect. Mine." He whispered words of love and admiration against her skin until she felt beautiful, desired, cherished in ways that made her forget every moment of doubt she'd ever had about her worth. When he finally joined with her, it was with a gentleness that brought tears to her eyes and passion that set every nerve ending ablaze. When they finally came together, it was with tenderness that brought tears to her eyes and passion that set her soul on fire. Phil held her gaze as he moved within her, his dark eyes full of love and wonder and promise of forever. "I love you," he said against her lips as they moved together in perfect rhythm. "I love you, Tasha, my beautiful, brave, perfect woman." "I love you too," she gasped, heart so full she thought it might burst. "I love you so much it scares me." "Don't be scared," Phil murmured, forehead pressed against hers. "This is just the beginning of everything we're going to build together." Afterward, they lay tangled in moonlight and contentment, Natasha's head on Phil's chest, while he traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "No regrets?" he asked softly. "Only that we waited so long," she said honestly, pressing a kiss to his chest where his heart beat strong and steady. "Though maybe we needed to wait. Maybe we needed time to trust each other completely." Phil chuckled, the sound rumbling through his chest. "We had to build the foundation before we could create the castle." "Speaking of which," Phil said, voice taking on careful hope, "there's something I've been carrying around for 3 weeks." "What kind of something?" Phil reached over to his bedside table and pulled out a small velvet box that made Natasha's breath catch. "The kind that involves asking the woman I love to marry me properly, with a ring and everything." Natasha felt the world tilt with joy as Phil opened the box to reveal a ring that was absolutely perfect. A classic solitaire diamond that caught the moonlight like captured starlight, elegant and timeless, and exactly what she would have chosen if she dared to dream that big. "I bought this 3 weeks ago," Phil admitted with endearing sheepishness, his voice soft in the moonlit intimacy of their bedroom. "Right after you told me about Jackson, I was sitting in the jeweler's shop looking at dozens of rings, and when I saw this one I knew. It was like it was waiting for you." He traced the band with one finger. "The jeweler said it was a vintage setting from the 1920s, but I had him reset it with a new stone. Something old and something new, like us." "This is perfect," Natasha whispered, voice thick with tears of happiness. "You're perfect." "Marry me, Tasha," Phil said seriously, dark eyes holding hers with unwavering certainty. "Not because of Jackson's memory, though that will always be part of our story. Marry me because I love you completely, because you and Jassim have become my whole world. Yes, Natasha said without hesitation. Yes to all of it. Marriage and adoption and forever and everything you're offering. Phil's smile was brilliant as he slipped the ring onto her finger. Good, because I was hoping you'd say that. As they kissed again under the Miami moonlight, their bodies still warm from lovemaking and their hearts full of promises, Natasha felt the last of her fears dissolve. She was safe, she was loved, she was home, and tomorrow their forever would officially begin. Chapter 9. Building Dreams Together. The diamond engagement ring on Natasha's finger caught the Miami morning light like captured stars, but the man standing at her apartment door threatened to shatter every dream that ring represented with just 4 words. I want my daughter. 6 months had passed since Bradford's arrest. 6 months of building the kind of happiness Natasha had never dared imagine. Phil's proposal had been everything she'd dreamed of. A private dinner on the rooftop of Coral Heights, with Jassim presenting the ring box while Phil got down on one knee and promised to love them both forever. The adoption papers for Jassim were nearly finalized, the wedding was planned for next month at Vizcaya Museum, and Natasha had even started her own financial consulting firm, Barrage Financial Solutions, with Phil's encouragement and connections. Everything was perfect, until James Ruffer showed up like a cancer returning when you thought you were finally healthy. "Hello, Natasha," he said with the same lazy charm that had once made her stupid enough to believe his promises. "You're looking prosperous." James looked exactly the same, sandy hair that never quite stayed neat, green eyes that catalogued everything with calculating precision, and casual arrogance that came from skating through life on charm and other people's generosity. He was also supposed to be in California, where he'd moved after making it clear that fatherhood held no appeal. The expensive cut of his clothes told a story that contradicted his claims of struggling. The new Rolex was the kind that cost more than most people's cars. James Ruffer hadn't come crawling back because he'd developed paternal instincts. He'd come because he'd seen opportunity. "James," Natasha managed, voice carefully neutral despite alarm bells screaming in her head. "What are you doing here?" "Can't a father visit his daughter?" James asked with mock innocence. His eyes swept past her into the apartment with obvious appreciation, cataloging artwork, fresh flowers, the kind of casual luxury that whispered of serious money. "Nice place? Very expensive. Business must be booming." Natasha stepped partially into the hallway, pulling the door mostly closed behind her. Jassim was inside getting ready for school, and James had no right to witness that morning routine. "You gave up parental rights," Natasha said quietly, voice carrying steel that had gotten her through 6 years of impossible circumstances. "You signed the papers, James. You made it clear you wanted nothing to do with us." "That was before I knew you'd hit the jackpot," James said with a smile that made her skin crawl. Imagine my surprise when I saw the engagement announcement in the Miami Herald. Natasha Barrage, successful businesswoman, engaged to billionaire developer Phil Most. His eyes glittered with greedy calculation. "You've certainly moved up in the world since our little encounter." The way he said encounter made her want to scrub her skin with bleach, as if Jassim's conception had been some casual hookup instead of what Natasha had believed was the beginning of something real. "What do you want?" Natasha cut straight to the heart of it, knowing James well enough to recognize the signs of a man with a scheme brewing. "To be part of Jassim's life," James said with practiced sincerity that would have been convincing if she hadn't seen him use the same tone to lie to his girlfriend about working late. "I've made mistakes, Natasha. I was young and scared when you told me you were pregnant. But I've grown up, matured. I want to know my daughter." "You've had 6 years to want to know her," Natasha said coldly, voice carrying accumulated fury of every sleepless night, every worried moment, Every time Jassim had asked why she didn't have a daddy, "She's better off without you." "See, that's where we disagree," James said, his mask of concern slipping to reveal the calculating opportunist beneath. "A little girl needs her father. Her real father, not some rich guy playing house with someone else's family." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Natasha felt ice forming in her veins as she realized James had done his homework. He knew about Phil, about their engagement, about the adoption proceedings. "Phil is more of a father to Jassim than you ever were or ever could be," she said fiercely. "Is he?" James's smile turned sharp. "Because legally I'm still her father. I may have given up some rights, but I never terminated my parental status completely, which means I could file for custody modification. Claim that you've been keeping my daughter from me, alienating her affections." Natasha's heart stopped. "You wouldn't dare." "Wouldn't I?" James leaned against the doorframe with casual confidence. "Think about it, Natasha. Young single mother struggling to make ends meet, suddenly engaged to a billionaire. How does that look to a family court judge? Like true love? Or like a gold digger who found her meal ticket? That's not what this is." "Of course it isn't," James said with false sympathy. "But perception is reality in family court, and I have a very good lawyer who thinks I have an excellent case for custody modification." "Mommy," Jassim's voice came from inside the apartment, getting closer with innocent curiosity. "Is someone here? I heard voices." James's eyes lit up with predatory interest that made Natasha's blood run cold. "That's her, isn't it? My daughter. She sounds older, more articulate. I'd love to meet her properly." "You need to leave," Natasha said urgently, panic clawing at her throat. "Now, before she sees you." "Actually, I think I'd like to introduce myself," James said, stepping closer to the door with entitlement that belonged to men who'd never been told no. "After all, a father has rights." "Over my dead body," a cold voice said from behind James, carrying quiet menace that made grown men reconsider their life choices. Both Natasha and James turned to find Phil standing in the hallway, and the expression on his face made Natasha's blood run cold, despite her relief. She'd seen Phil angry before, but this was different. This was the face of a man capable of violence, held in check only by iron will. "Mr. Most, I presume," James said with false bravado, though he took an involuntary step backward. "I'm James Ruffer, Jassim's father." "No," Phil said with deadly quiet. "You're a sperm donor who abandoned his responsibilities. I'm Jassim's father in every way that matters." "Legally? Legally, you're about to find yourself in a world of trouble if you don't get away from my family right now," Phil interrupted, voice carrying authority that had built empires and destroyed competitors. James's mask finally slipped completely, revealing the desperate opportunist beneath. "Look, this doesn't have to get ugly. I'm a reasonable man, and I understand that everyone has interests to protect. A man in my position has expenses, debts that need settling. Maybe we could work out some kind of arrangement." "Ah," Phil said with satisfaction, "there it is. You're not here for Jassim. You're here for money." "I'm here for my daughter," James insisted, but his eyes darted nervously like a cornered animal. "Though I suppose if someone wanted to make this transition easier for everyone involved." "How much?" Phil asked bluntly, voice carrying businesslike efficiency. "Phil, no," Natasha said quickly, every instinct screaming against rewarding extortion. "We don't negotiate with people who threaten children." "How much?" Phil repeated, eyes never leaving James's face. James licked his lips, scenting victory despite the obvious danger. "2 million, cash, and I'll sign whatever papers you want. Disappear forever." "Done," Phil said without hesitation, voice carrying casual tone most people used to discuss dinner plans. "Phil," Natasha stared at him in shock. $2 million, Phil continued calmly, voice taking on formal precision, transferred to your account the moment you sign termination papers, giving up all parental rights permanently. Preston Ward will have the documents ready within the hour. James's smile was triumphant. I knew you were a reasonable businessman. But, Phil interrupted, voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more terrifying than shouting, if you ever come near my family again, if you ever contact Jassim or speak her name in public, if you even think about her, I will destroy you so completely that you'll wish you'd never been born. The promise hung in the air like a death sentence. James swallowed hard, finally recognizing that he was dealing with a predator far more dangerous than himself. We have a deal? James asked, his voice smaller now. We have a deal, Phil said pleasantly. Preston will call you with the details within the hour. James practically ran for the elevator, and Phil waited until the doors closed before turning to Natasha, who was staring at him with a mixture of gratitude, concern, and awe. $2 million, she asked quietly. Pocket change, Phil said simply, tone suggesting he was being literally accurate. And worth every penny to keep him away from Jassim forever. Phil, you can't just buy off every threat. I can and I will, Phil interrupted fiercely, voice carrying protective determination. That man was never going to give up, Tasha. He would have dragged us through courts for years, traumatized Jassim with custody battles. This way, he's gone forever. Mommy. Jassim's voice came through the door, closer now and tinged with concern. Can I come out now? I heard Uncle Phil's voice. Phil and Natasha exchanged a look, silent communication that spoke to the depth of understanding they'd developed. Come on out, Princess, Phil called. Uncle Phil brought those chocolate croissants from that bakery you love. Jassim burst through the door and launched herself into Phil's arms with complete trust. Did the scary man leave? He made Mommy's voice sound worried. He's gone, Phil assured her, holding her close. And he's never coming back. Good, Jassim said with 5-year-old finality. I don't like strangers who make Mommy nervous. We're a family, right? Just us three? Just us three, Phil confirmed, voice thick with emotion as he met Natasha's eyes. Forever and always. As Phil carried Jassim inside, chattering about school and breakfast and weekend plans, Natasha followed with a heart full of gratitude and love, so profound it threatened to overwhelm her. The threat was over. James Ruffer could take his $2 million and disappear into whatever meaningless existence awaited men who sold their children for money. Their family would be officially, legally, permanently protected. And in 3 weeks it would all be sealed when she became Mrs. Phil Most, and Jassim became Jassim Most, and their fairy tale became permanent reality. James Ruffer was already forgotten. Their real life was just beginning, and it was going to be absolutely perfect. Chapter 10, Forever Starts Now. Standing in the bridal suite at Vizcaya Museum while her daughter practiced walking down an imaginary aisle in her flower girl dress, Natasha realized that happiness this profound should be impossible, except that in 30 minutes it would be beautifully, officially, forever real when she became Mrs. Phil Most. The Mediterranean villa seemed like something from a fairy tale, its coral stone walls and elaborate gardens providing the perfect backdrop for what felt like the wedding of her dreams. Through the tall windows, she could see Biscayne Bay sparkling in the late afternoon light, sailboats dotting the water like white butterflies. "Mommy, you look like a princess," Jassim announced, spinning in her powder blue dress with uninhibited joy. "The prettiest princess in the whole world." Natasha looked at herself in the antique mirror and had to admit Jassim was right. The wedding dress Phil had commissioned from a New York designer was a masterpiece of ivory silk and Alençon lace that made her feel like royalty. The Barrage family pearls, rescued from a pawn shop years ago and reset by Miami's finest jeweler as Phil's wedding gift, glowed against her throat like captured moonlight. "You clean up nice, girl," said Florissa, Natasha's cousin and maid of honor, adjusting the cathedral-length veil with hands that trembled with emotion. At 45, Florissa had helped raise Natasha after their parents died, and seeing her little cousin in a designer wedding dress was almost more than her heart could handle. "Though I gotta say, I never thought I'd see the day when you'd let a man take care of you like this." "He's not taking care of me," Natasha corrected softly, watching Jassim practice her flower-throwing technique. "We're taking care of each other. There's a difference." "Uh-huh." Wilma, Natasha's other cousin and bridesmaid, grinned from her perch by the window. "That's why he paid off your student loans, bought you a building for your business, and just finalized those adoption papers yesterday." Yesterday. Natasha's heart still skipped when she remembered Preston Ward calling to confirm that Jassy Most was now legally, officially, completely Phil's daughter. James Ruffer's termination papers had been filed, his $2 million payment had cleared, and he disappeared from their lives completely. "The adoption went through?" asked Savannah Blake, who'd become like a sister to Natasha over months of wedding planning and business building. "Yesterday afternoon," Natasha confirmed, voice thick with emotion. "Jassim is officially a Most now." "I'm Jassim Most," the little girl announced proudly, having been eavesdropping with shameless efficiency. "And after the wedding, Mommy will be Natasha Most, and we'll all have the same name like a real family." "You were already a real family, baby," Wilma said gently. "Now you're just making it official." A soft knock interrupted the moment, and Father McKenna peeked inside with his warm smile. As the priest who'd baptized both Phil and Jackson 20 years ago, he understood the emotional weight of this wedding in ways that went beyond the usual joining of two people in love. "Ladies, it's time," he said gently, his Irish accent softened by decades in South Florida. "The guests are seated, the groom is pacing in the gardens, and this old priest is ready to perform the most joyful ceremony of his career." Natasha's stomach fluttered with nervous excitement. 200 guests were waiting in Vizcaya's formal gardens, business associates, friends, the small family of people who'd chosen to love each other despite having no blood ties. "Is Uncle Phil nervous?" Jassim asked with 6-year-old curiosity. "Very nervous," Savannah confirmed with amusement. "He keeps asking if your mommy might change her mind and run away." "That's silly," Jassim giggled. "Mommy loves Uncle Phil. She told him so every day for months." "Out of the mouths of babes," Florissa murmured, giving Natasha one final hug. "Ready to go get your happily ever after." Natasha looked around the room at the women who'd helped her reach this moment, her cousins who'd supported her through every struggle, Savannah who'd become like the sister she'd never had, and most importantly, Jassim, whose unconditional love had made her brave enough to accept the love Phil offered. "Ready," she said with certainty that surprised her with its strength. The formal gardens at Vizcaya had been transformed into something from a fairy tale. White roses and gardenias created an archway that framed the altar, their perfume mingling with the salt breeze to create an atmosphere that felt both elegant and natural. The late afternoon Miami sun painted everything in shades of gold and coral, and the Baroque architecture provided a backdrop that looked like a Renaissance painting. But Natasha only had eyes for the man waiting for her at the end of the rose-petal-strewn aisle. Phil looked devastating in his black tuxedo, custom-tailored to emphasize the strong lines of his shoulders and lean elegance. His dark hair was perfectly styled despite what Savannah had described as a morning of nervous fidgeting, and when their eyes met across the distance separating them, his smile was brilliant enough to power the entire city. He pressed his hand to his heart in the gesture that had become their private signal, a reminder of the day she'd first seen him as more than just her landlord. The string quartet began the processional, and Floresa and Wilma walked down the aisle with grace befitting such an elegant occasion. The music was Pachelbel's canon, arranged with Latin guitar that honored Miami's cultural heritage and made the familiar melody feel fresh and personal. Then came Jassim, her little face serious with concentration as she scattered rose petals with careful precision, pausing every few steps to wave at guests who cooed over her adorable performance. She wore the powder blue dress Phil had commissioned from the same designer, with tiny pearls embroidered along the bodice that caught the light like dewdrops. Finally, Wagner's wedding march began, and Natasha stepped onto the aisle alone. She'd chosen to walk herself down the aisle rather than ask one of her cousins to stand in for the father she'd lost so young, carrying the memory of both her parents and Jackson in her heart, since they couldn't be there to witness this moment. But as she moved toward Phil, she felt their presence like warm embraces, and she could have sworn she heard Jackson's voice whispering that he was proud of the woman she'd become, proud of the man she'd chosen, proud of the family they were creating from love and loss, and beautiful recognition that some things were always meant to be. Phil's eyes never left her face as she walked toward him, and she could see the moment he recognized her mother's pearls at her throat. His smile became even more radiant, and when she finally reached the altar, he took her hands with reverence usually reserved for priceless artifacts. "You're so beautiful," he whispered, just for her ears. "You clean up pretty well yourself," she whispered back, making him laugh with pure joy. Father McKenna cleared his throat with gentle authority. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today in this place of beauty and history to witness the union of Philip Most and Natasha Berridge in holy matrimony." The ceremony passed in a blur of perfect moments that felt like scenes from the most beautiful dream she'd never dared to have. Phil's voice was steady and sure as he promised to love, honor, and cherish her for all the days of his life, his vows carrying the weight of absolute commitment. His hands remained steady on hers, even as she saw tears gathering in his dark eyes. "Natasha," he said, voice carrying across the gardens, "you walked into my life in a rainstorm and changed everything. You taught me that home isn't a building, it's wherever you and Jassim are. I promise to protect your hearts, to honor your strength, and to spend every day proving that you deserve all the love I have to give." Her own voice trembled only slightly as she vowed to stand by his side through whatever challenges and joys lay ahead, to be his partner in building the kind of love that honored both their individual strengths and their collective dreams. "Phil," she said, her voice carrying over the gardens, "you saw me when I felt invisible, loved me when I felt broken. You gave Jassim the father she dreamed of, and gave me the courage to believe in forever. I promise to love you with the same fierce devotion you've shown us." When Father McKenna asked for the rings, Jassim stepped forward with solemn importance, presenting the simple platinum bands that would bind them together. "Do you, Philip, take Natasha to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, for as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Phil said with such conviction that his voice carried across the gardens. "Do you, Natasha, take Philip to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, for as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Natasha said, her voice clear and strong, despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. "By the power vested in me by the state of Florida, I now pronounce you husband and wife." Father McKenna's smile was radiant. "Phil, you may kiss your bride." Phil's kiss was soft and sweet and full of promise, and when they broke apart, the gardens erupted in cheers and applause. But in that moment, Natasha was only aware of Phil's hands framing her face and his dark eyes shining with love and wonder. "Hello, Mrs. Most," he said softly. "Hello, Mr. Most," she replied, testing out the name that would be hers for the rest of her life. "Are you happy?" "I'm perfect," she said honestly. "We're perfect." The reception was everything Natasha had dreamed of, elegant, joyful, and filled with people who genuinely celebrated their love. The dinner was prepared by a chef Phil had flown in from New Orleans, featuring sophisticated French technique applied to fresh Florida seafood, Cuban-inspired dishes that honored Miami's heritage, and desserts that made Jassim clap with delight. The ballroom at Vizcaya had been transformed with thousands of white orchids and soft golden lighting that made everyone look beautiful. Tables were set with vintage china and crystal that caught the candlelight like stars, while a jazz trio played softly in the background, the same musicians who'd performed at Jackson's favorite Miami Beach Club, Phil's subtle tribute to the friend who'd brought them together. The first dance was to At Last by Etta James, performed live by a singer whose voice carried all the joy and longing the lyrics promised. As Phil spun her around the dance floor with practiced ease, Natasha felt like she was floating, weightless with happiness that seemed too perfect for the real world. This was her life now, dancing with her husband while their daughter giggled from the sidelines, surrounded by people who'd chosen to love them. "Penny for your thoughts," Phil murmured against her ear. "Just thinking about how far we've come," Natasha said, watching Jassim teaching some of Phil's business associates how to properly execute a twirl. "A year ago, I was a struggling single mother who could barely afford bus fare. Now I'm married to the most wonderful man in the world." "Our daughter," Phil repeated with satisfaction that never diminished. "I love the sound of that." "She loves you so much," Natasha said, voice thick with emotion. "You've given her something I never could alone, the security of knowing she's completely wanted and protected." "You gave her that first," Phil corrected. "You loved her enough to fight for her every single day. I just added my love to yours." As the song ended, Jassim ran onto the dance floor and threw her arms around both of them. "Family hug," she announced, and suddenly they were surrounded by warm embraces of their chosen family, Floresa and Wilma, Savannah and Preston, even some of Phil's business associates who'd been charmed by their love story. The evening continued with toasts that made everyone laugh and cry, dancing that lasted until the stars came out over Biscayne Bay, and joy that felt too large for any single moment to contain. When the last guests departed with promises to see them after their honeymoon in Tuscany, Phil and Natasha stood on Vizcaya's terrace with Jassim between them, looking out over the Miami skyline that sparkled like a promise. "What now?" Natasha asked, leaning against Phil's shoulder while Jassim dozed in his arms. "Now we live happily ever after," Phil said simply. "We watch Jassim grow up strong and smart and beautiful like her mother. We build our businesses and our family and our love. We honor Jackson's memory by living the life he would have wanted for all of us. And we never take any of it for granted," Natasha added softly. "Never," Phil agreed, pressing a kiss to her head. "Though I have a feeling Jackson's going to make sure we remember to appreciate what we have." "How?" Phil smiled, eyes soft with love and mischief and wonder. "Let's just say I have it on good authority that this family might be getting bigger in the not-too-distant future." Natasha looked up at him in surprise. "Phil Most, are you telling me you want more children?" "I'm telling you that I want everything with you," he said seriously. "More children, more adventures, more quiet Sunday mornings and chaotic holiday dinners. I want to grow old with you and spoil our grandchildren and still be holding your hand when we're 90. "That sounds perfect," Natasha said, her heart so full she thought it might overflow. Absolutely perfect. As they carried their sleeping daughter toward the car that would take them home to the life they'd built together, Natasha felt the final piece of her broken heart heal completely. She was home. They were home, and their forever had officially begun. Epilogue. 1 year later. The pregnancy test showed 2 pink lines, and as Natasha stared at it with wonder and joy, she heard Phil's key in the lock of their new house on Key Biscayne, the one they'd built together with panoramic views of the bay and enough rooms for the family they were planning. Jassim was at her first sleepover, which meant they had the evening to themselves. Perfect timing for sharing the news that their family was about to grow. Tasha? Phil's voice carried up the stairs. I'm home. Up here, she called, hiding the test behind her back as his footsteps approached their bedroom. How was your day? He asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind. You look like you have a secret. I do, she said, turning in his arms with a smile that made his eyes light up. Good secret or earth-shattering secret? The best secret, she said, pulling out the pregnancy test. We're having a baby. Phil's expression cycled through surprise, wonder, and pure joy before settling on happiness that made her fall in love with him all over again. Really? He asked, voice rough with emotion. Really? Phil swept her off her feet and spun her around their bedroom, both of them laughing with joy that came from dreams expanding beyond anything they'd imagined. I love you, he said against her lips. I love you too, she replied. Our whole beautiful, growing family. Outside their windows, Miami sparkled in the afternoon sun like a jeweled promise. And somewhere in the warm breeze, Natasha could have sworn she heard Jackson's laughter on the wind, finally at peace, knowing his family was exactly where they belonged. Home. Together. Forever.